The year is 1568. The location is the sweltering, fever-ridden harbor of San Juan de Ulua on the coast of modern-day Mexico. The water is still, shimmering under the relentless heat of the Spanish Main, and the air is heavy with the scent of salt, tar, and impending violence. In the harbor, a small, battered fleet of English ships rides at anchor, their sails furled, their crews exhausted. They are far from home, intruders in a world that belongs entirely to the King of Spain. Among them is a young man in his 20s, a roughly spoken sailor from Devon named Francis Drake. At this moment, he is nobody. He is merely a junior captain, commanding a small 50-ton bark called the Judith. He is looking across the water at the massive Spanish galleons that block the harbor entrance, their guns run out, their decks bristling with soldiers. He is looking at death. History remembers Francis Drake as the confident, swaggering hero who singed the King of Spain's beard. But to understand the man, we must first understand the boy who watched his world burn on this humid September afternoon. This was the day the music stopped. This was the day the rules of chivalry were drowned in blood. The English, led by Drake's cousin John Hawkins, were technically at peace with Spain. They were merchants, armed merchants, certainly, and smugglers by trade, but they were not at war. They had entered the harbor desperate for repairs and fresh water, battered by storms. A truce had been struck with the new Spanish viceroy, Don Martin Enriquez. Hostages had been exchanged. Promises had been made on the honor of gentlemen. The English believed that the code of conduct at sea would protect them. They were wrong. While the English sailors worked on their damaged hulls, the Spanish were quietly moving men into position. It began not with a declaration of war, but with a signal. A white scarf waved from the Spanish flagship. In an instant, the uneasy silence was shattered by the deafening roar of shore batteries. The Spanish had turned the island fortress's guns inward, directly onto the sitting ducks of the English fleet. The water around the English ships erupted into geysers of white foam. Cannonballs smashed through oak planks, sending deadly showers of razor-sharp splinters tearing through the flesh of the crew. It was a massacre. Spanish soldiers, hidden aboard hulks nearby, poured over the sides, swords drawn, cutting down men before they could even reach for their weapons. The harbor turned into a slaughterhouse. Drake, aboard the tiny Judith, watched in horror as the flagship, the Jesus of Lubeck, was pummeled into a wreck. He saw his countrymen trapped, fighting back to back on burning decks, overwhelmed by hundreds of Spanish troops. The scream of dying men mixed with the thunder of artillery. The English fought with the desperation of the damned, but the trap was perfect. The viceroy had never intended to let these heretics leave alive. In the chaos, the chain of command disintegrated. It was every ship for itself. The Jesus of Lubeck, the pride of the fleet, was lost, captured along with the vast fortune in gold and pearls they had amassed over months of trading. Hawkins managed to scramble onto the smaller ship, the Minion, which was already dangerously overloaded with survivors. Drake made a decision that critics would debate for centuries, seeing that the battle was lost and that to stay meant certain death or the fires of the Inquisition. He cut his cables. The Judith turned her prow toward the open sea. He left the carnage behind. He left the burning ships. He left hundreds of his countrymen to be captured, tortured, or enslaved in the galleys of the Spanish Empire. As the Judith slipped away into the darkening horizon, the sound of the guns faded, replaced by the rhythmic crash of the waves. But the silence that followed was heavier than the noise of battle. Drake had escaped with his life, but he had lost everything else. His first major command had ended in catastrophic humiliation. He had been lied to, betrayed, and beaten. The voyage home was a nightmare of starvation and thirst, but it gave Francis Drake time to think. As he looked back at the wake of his ship, trailing away from the Spanish Main, something hardened within him. The merchant was dead. The naive sailor who believed in the honor of gentlemen was gone. In his place, a new creature was born in the ashes of San Juan de Ulua. He did not just want reparations. He did not just want his money back. He wanted blood. He swore a personal biblical vendetta against the King of Spain and the Catholic Church. He would return to these waters, not as a trader asking for permission to dock, but as a terrifying ghost who struck from the shadows. The Spanish had taught him a brutal lesson, that there is no law beyond the line, and it was a lesson he would teach back to them with interest for the rest of his life. The dragon had been woken. To understand the fury that burned within Francis Drake, We must look away from the blood-stained waters of the Caribbean and gaze instead upon the cold, austere stone of the Escorial Palace, deep in the heart of Spain. Here, in a small, candlelit room, sat a man who was the antithesis of the rough-hewn sailor from Devon. King Philip II of Spain was the most powerful monarch the world had ever seen. He was a colossus who straddled the globe, the ruler of an empire upon which the sun truly never set. From the Spice Islands of the East to the silver mines of the Americas, his word was law. In the mid-16th century, Spain was not merely a country, it was a terrifying, monolithic engine of conquest. Its armies, the feared tercios, were the finest killing machines in Europe, undefeated and disciplined. Its navy dominated the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, but the true source of Spanish power lay deep beneath the mountains of the New World. The silver mines of Potosi in modern-day Bolivia were churning out wealth on a scale that was previously unimaginable. Every year, the treasure fleets, the Flota de Indias, crossed the Atlantic, their hulls groaning under the weight of bullion. This river of silver flowed directly into Philip's coffers, funding his wars, bribing his enemies, and building the magnificent cathedrals of the Counter-Reformation. Against this titan stood England, a small, damp, and deeply divided island on the periphery of Europe. To the great powers of the continent, England was a joke, a rogue state ruled by a bastard queen. Elizabeth I had ascended the throne of a bankrupt nation. The royal treasury was empty, depleted by the wars of her father and sister. Her military was non-existent. There was no standing army to speak of, and the Royal Navy was a rotting collection of timber, barely capable of patrolling the coastline, let alone challenging the masters of the ocean. But the disparity was not just military or economic, it was existential. The world was being torn apart by the violent schism of the Reformation. Europe was ablaze with religious war. To Philip II, the self-appointed sword of the Catholic Church, Elizabeth was not a legitimate sovereign. She was a heretic, a Jezebel who had led her people astray from the true faith. The Pope had excommunicated her, essentially placing a bounty on her head and absolving her subjects of their allegiance. England was surrounded. To the south lay Spain, to the north, Scotland was allied with France, and within her own borders, half the population still whispered prayers to Rome in secret. The geopolitical reality was suffocating. If Spain decided to move against England, the math was simple. England would cease to exist. There would be no contest. The Spanish war machine would roll over the English countryside, the Inquisition would set up its tribunals in London, and the Protestant experiment would be extinguished in blood and fire. Elizabeth knew this. Her advisors, men like William Cecil and Francis Walsingham, knew this. They lived in a state of perpetual, high-stakes paranoia, watching the horizon for the sails of an invasion fleet that they had no hope of stopping. Diplomacy was a delicate dance on the edge of a precipice. Elizabeth had to keep Philip talking, keep him distracted, and avoid open war at all costs. She could not afford a war. She could not afford the gunpowder, let alone the ships. But she also could not afford to sit idle while Spain grew stronger with every shipment of Peruvian silver. She needed to slow them down. She needed to cut the artery of gold that fed the Spanish heart. But how does a pauper rob a king? This was the impossible deadlock of 1568. England needed a navy to defend itself, but it had no money to build one. It needed to weaken Spain, but it could not declare war. The solution that emerged was born of pure desperation. If the crown could not afford a navy, it would have to outsource the war. It would have to turn to the private sector, to the smugglers, the adventurers, and the cutthroats who haunted the ports of Devon and Cornwall. This is where the dark truth of the Elizabethan Golden Age lies. The survival of the state did not rest on the shoulders of chivalrous knights or noble admirals. It rested on men who were technically criminals. The government began to issue letters of marque, pieces of parchment that gave private captains the legal right to attack Spanish shipping. It was state-sponsored piracy, a way to wage a secret war without technically breaking the peace. It was a strategy born of weakness, a gamble of the highest order. Elizabeth was essentially handing matches to pyromaniacs and asking them to burn down her neighbor's house without getting caught holding the box. She needed men who were reckless enough to sail into the jaws of the Spanish Empire, skilled enough to survive, and ruthless enough to do what was necessary. She needed men who had nothing to lose. And in the autumn of 1568, a young man returned to Plymouth, his eyes burning with the memory of a massacre at San Juan de Ulua, looking for exactly this kind of opportunity. The geopolitical stage was set. The impossible stakes were laid out. The world was a powder keg waiting for a spark, and Francis Drake was holding the flint. The collision between the bankrupt island and the global empire was inevitable, but it would not be fought on a battlefield. It would be fought in the shadows of the ocean, where the only law was the range of a cannon. The year is 1572. Francis Drake returns to the Caribbean, but the man who steps onto the burning sands of the Panamanian coast is unrecognizable from the merchant who fled San Juan de Ulua 4 years earlier. He has not come to trade. He has not come to negotiate. He has come to wage a private war. He leaves Plymouth with a force so laughably small it sounds like a suicide pact, 2 tiny ships, the Pasha and the Swan, and a crew of just 73 men. Most of them are boys, really. The oldest man on board is 50, and he is the exception. They are setting out to attack the fortified treasure ports of the Spanish Empire. By all conventional military logic, they should be dead within a week. But Drake has abandoned conventional logic. He realizes that he cannot fight Spain on Spain's terms. He cannot line up in a gentlemanly formation and exchange broadsides with galleons that have hulls 4 feet thick. Instead, he invents a new kind of naval warfare. He becomes a phantom. He strikes where the map is blank. He weaponizes the element of surprise, turning the Spanish confidence into their greatest weakness. His target is the throat of the Spanish Empire, the Isthmus of Panama. This narrow strip of jungle is the most valuable piece of real estate on Earth. It is the bottleneck through which all the silver of Peru flows on its way to the Atlantic coast to be loaded onto the treasure fleet. If he can pinch this artery, he can stop the heart of the empire. His first move is an audacious night raid on the town of Nombre de Dios. He tells his terrified crew, "I have brought you to the mouth of the treasure of the world." They storm the town, seizing the governor's house and finding a room stacked with silver bars, a pile 70 feet long and 10 feet high. But the raid ends in chaos. Drake is shot in the leg, losing a dangerous amount of blood, and a tropical storm dampens their gunpowder. His men, fearing their captain is dying, drag him back to the boats, leaving the silver behind. It is a failure, but a magnificent one. It teaches Drake that he cannot hold a town. He does not have the numbers. He needs to disappear. He retreats into the suffocating green hell of the Darien Gap, the dense jungle interior. Here, the Spanish soldiers, encased in heavy steel armor and terrified of the unknown, dare not follow. But Drake is not alone in the jungle. In a stroke of strategic genius that defines his adaptability, he forges an alliance that terrifies the Spanish even more than his cannons. He meets the Cimarrons, Africans who had escaped Spanish slavery and established free communities deep in the forest. Only a few years prior, Drake had been a slaver. Now, he relies on escaped slaves for his survival. It is a relationship born of mutual hatred for a common enemy. The Cimarrons know the secret paths. They know when the mule trains move. They are the eyes and ears of the jungle. With the Cimarrons as his guides, Drake plans the ultimate ambush. They trek inland, lying in wait for the silver train, the long caravan of mules carrying the king's fortune from the Pacific to the Caribbean. For days they wait in the humid silence, fighting off mosquitoes and hunger. Then they hear it, the ringing of mule bells. A train of 190 mules is approaching, unguarded, confident in the safety of the interior. The ambush is swift and brutal. The English and Cimarrons burst from the foliage. The Spanish guards flee in panic. In moments, Drake is standing amidst a fortune that defies comprehension. There is so much silver that they cannot carry it all. They are forced to bury tons of it in crab holes and riverbanks, taking only the gold, which is lighter. It is a heist of staggering proportions. When Drake finally returns to the coast and sails for England, he leaves behind a psychological wound that will never heal. He has violated the sanctity of the Spanish Empire. He has proven that the king's gold is not safe, even in his own backyard. The Spanish governors write frantic letters to King Philip, speaking of a demon who appears out of the mist, strikes with the speed of lightning, and vanishes before a counterattack can be mustered. They stop calling him by his name. In the dispatches, he becomes simply El Drac, the dragon, a mythical monster that cannot be caught, only feared. He returns to Plymouth on a Sunday morning in August 1573. The story goes that the congregation at St. Andrew's Church heard the roar of his cannon salute and simply stood up and walked out in the middle of the sermon to see him. The hero had returned. He had left as a fugitive. He came back as a millionaire. But more importantly, he had proven a dangerous truth. The giant could be bled. The psychological mystique of Spanish invincibility was shattered. The privateer had set the stage. Now he was ready for the main act. In the winter of 1577, 5 small ships slipped quietly out of Plymouth Sound. Their destination was officially listed as Alexandria, Egypt, for a simple trading voyage. It was a lie. The true orders, whispered in secret chambers by Queen Elizabeth herself, were so explosive that to write them down would have been an act of war. Francis Drake was not going to Egypt. He was going to the one place on earth where England was forbidden to go. He was going to breach the Spanish Lake, the Pacific Ocean. This was not an expedition of scientific curiosity. It was a raid of global proportions, a clandestine strike aimed at the unprotected underbelly of the Spanish Empire. But before Drake could fight the Spanish, he had to fight his own fleet. The Atlantic crossing was a nightmare of storms, delays, and simmering resentment. The ships were leaking, the crews were superstitious, and the morale was rotting as fast as the food stores. It was in the bleak, windswept harbor of Port St. Julian, on the desolate coast of Argentina, that the darkness of the voyage reached its peak. This was a cursed place. Half a century earlier, Magellan had executed mutineers on these very sands. Now history repeated itself. Drake uncovered a plot to overthrow him, led by Thomas Doughty, a gentleman, a courtier, and Drake's own friend. The trial was a piece of theatre that defined Drake's character forever. He could not allow dissent. In this frozen wasteland, thousands of miles from English law, Drake became the law. He acted as judge, jury, and executioner. Doughty was beheaded. It was a cold, brutal act of authority. Drake told his men that there were no longer gentlemen and sailors on this voyage. They were all one crew, bound by one will, his own. When the axe fell, the democratic privateer died, and the iron-fisted admiral was born. Terrorized into obedience, the fleet pressed on into the Strait of Magellan. This narrow, twisting passage at the bottom of the world was a graveyard of ships, battered by the ferocious winds of the Southern Ocean. It took them 16 days of hellish navigation to break through, but the ocean on the other side was not Pacific or peaceful. A massive storm scattered the fleet. One ship sank with all hands, the others turned back in terror. When the skies finally cleared, Francis Drake was alone. His flagship, renamed the Golden Hind, was the solitary English speck in an ocean that Spain considered its private property. By all rights, he should have retreated. Instead, he turned north. He was a wolf let loose in a sheep pen. The Spanish colonies on the Pacific coast of South America were entirely undefended. They had no walls, no cannons, and no sentries, because the idea of an English ship sailing this far was considered impossible. Drake sailed into the harbor of Valparaiso and found a Spanish ship whose crew was sleeping. They assumed the Golden Hind was Spanish. Who else could it be? Drake's men boarded them, not with swords drawn, but with laughter. They looted the town, taking wine, gold, and maps, leaving the Spanish waking up to a reality they couldn't comprehend. As he moved north, panic spread like wildfire ahead of him, but Drake was faster. He was chasing the ultimate prize. He had learned of a massive galleon, the Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, nicknamed by her crew the Cacafuego, the fire shit, because of her immense firepower. She was sailing for Panama, her hold groaning with the annual output of the Peruvian silver mines. The chase lasted for weeks. Drake pushed the Golden Hind to her breaking point, wetting the sails to catch every breath of wind. On the 1st of March 1579, off the coast of Ecuador, he spotted her. The capture of the Cacafuego is the stuff of legend. It was not a battle, it was a mugging. Drake, ever the trickster, trailed empty wine jars behind his ship to slow it down, making the Golden Hind look like a sluggish merchant vessel. When the Spanish captain slowed to identify this stranger, Drake struck. "Strike sail, or you are a dog," he roared. A single chain shot tore down the Spanish mizzenmast. English archers swept the deck. It was over in minutes. When they opened the hatch of the Cacafuego, the English sailors stood in stunned silence. They were looking at the wealth of nations. It took 3 days to transfer the cargo. There were 80 pounds of gold, 26 tons of silver, thousands of coins and jewels. In today's value, it was hundreds of millions of pounds. It was enough to pay off England's entire national debt and have enough left over to build a new navy. Drake was now the richest pirate in history, but he was also the most hunted man on Earth. Every Spanish warship in the Pacific was now searching for him. He could not go back through the Strait of Magellan. The Spanish would be waiting. He was trapped in the Pacific. He made a decision that was as insane as it was brilliant. He would go forward. He would sail north, searching for the fabled Northwest Passage, and when that failed, he turned west. He would cross the vast, unknown emptiness of the Pacific Ocean to get home. The crossing was a feat of endurance that rivals any in maritime history. For months, they saw nothing but blue water. The Golden Hind, heavy with treasure and leaking badly, limped across the world. They navigated the treacherous reefs of Indonesia, nearly sinking on a sandbank in a moment of terrifying suspense, where Drake made the crew pray for their souls before the wind miraculously shifted and freed them. When the Golden Hind finally limped into Plymouth Harbor in September 1580, she had been gone for nearly 3 years. Most had assumed Drake was dead. The ship was battered, the sails were rotting, and the crew was gaunt. But beneath the barnacles lay a ballast of silver. Drake asked the first fishermen he saw a simple question: "Is the Queen alive?" For if she was dead and a Catholic sat on the throne, he was a dead man. But Elizabeth was alive. Francis Drake had done the impossible. He had circumnavigated the globe, not for science, but to rob the King of Spain blind in his own house. He had proven that the Spanish Empire was not a contiguous block of iron, but a balloon that could be popped. He was the master thief of the unknown world, and he had just pulled off the greatest heist in history. The return of the Golden Hind presented Queen Elizabeth I with the most dangerous dilemma of her reign. Francis Drake had not just brought back treasure, he had brought back a diplomatic crisis of catastrophic proportions. The sheer volume of the loot was staggering. As the silver was quietly offloaded at night and transporting to the Tower of London, the clerks stopped counting by coin and started weighing by the ton. The final tally was kept a state secret, known only as the Golden Secret, but the estimates suggest the haul was worth nearly double the Queen's entire annual tax revenue. In a single voyage, Drake had transformed England from a bankrupt pauper into a solvent power. But with the gold came the fury of Spain. The Spanish ambassador in London, the formidable Don Bernardino de Mendoza, was incandescent with rage. He stormed into the royal court demanding an audience. He did not mince his words. He called Drake the master thief of the unknown world. He demanded the immediate return of the stolen property and the head of Francis Drake on a spike. To Mendoza and to King Philip II in Madrid, this was not an act of war, it was an act of international terrorism. If Elizabeth accepted the money, she was no longer just a monarch, she was a fence for stolen goods. For months, Elizabeth played for time. She was the master of procrastination, keeping Mendoza at bay with vague promises of an investigation while quietly ensuring the jewels found their way into her own wardrobe. She knew that tonight Drake would be the ultimate provocation. It would be a public statement that England no longer recognized the Pope's division of the world. It would be a slap in the face of the most powerful man on earth. But Elizabeth also knew something else. The gold had bought her freedom. It paid off the foreign loans. It refitted the navy. It bought loyalty. And in her heart, she admired the audacity of the Devon sailor. He was a man after her own heart, ruthless, lucky, and fiercely Protestant. On the 4th of April 1581, the Queen made her choice. She travelled down the Thames to Diptford, where the Golden Hind had been dry-docked, treated not as a ship, but as a national monument. The scene was pure theatre, a spectacle designed for the eyes of Europe. Thousands of Londoners lined the banks. The ship was decked in banners. A banquet was laid out on the weather deck, the very planks that had soaked up the blood of Spanish sailors and the salt of the Pacific. When Elizabeth stepped aboard, she wore the crown jewels, but she also wore a new piece of jewelry, a magnificent emerald frog, a gift from Drake, a playful nod to the crawling courtiers she despised. Drake knelt before her. He was a commoner, a man of obscure birth, a former slaver and a pirate. By the laws of international diplomacy, he should have been in irons. The Queen asked for a sword. The crowd held its breath. She turned to the French ambassador, Monsieur de Marchemont, and handed the weapon to him. It was a stroke of Machiavellian genius. By asking the Frenchman to perform the dubbing, she was symbolically tying France to England's actions, implicating them in the insult to Spain. It was a diplomatic masterstroke, spreading the blame while claiming the glory. The blade touched Drake's shoulder. "Arise, Sir Francis Drake." The message was deafening. It echoed across the channel to the Escorial Palace. Elizabeth had not just pardoned the criminal, she had canonized him. She had taken the dragon, the man Philip called a devil, and made him a knight of the realm. It was the end of the pretense. The Cold War that had simmered between England and Spain for decades was officially over. Elizabeth had drawn a line in the sand, or rather, on the deck of a pirate ship. Drake rose a knight, but he was also now a marked man. There was no going back. The Queen had staked her throne on the strength of his reputation. The immense wealth of the Golden Hind would now be used to build the ships that would defend the island, for everyone present knew what this meant. Diplomacy was dead. The ambassadors could pack their bags. The lawyers had failed. Now it was time for the cannons. By 1587, the Cold War was a memory. The shadow of the axe was falling over England. Across the Channel, the intelligence reports terrified the Queen's Council. The enterprise of England, King Philip's grand plan for invasion, was no longer a concept on a map. It was iron and timber. In the ports of Lisbon and Cadiz, the Spanish were assembling a fleet of a magnitude the world had never seen. They were gathering the ships, the men, and the supplies to end the Protestant heresy once and for all. In London, the atmosphere was one of paralyzed dread. The Queen hesitated. She famously detested war, with its unpredictable costs and uncertain outcomes, but Francis Drake knew that waiting was suicide. He understood a fundamental truth of naval warfare that his contemporaries had not yet grasped. The sea has no walls. If you wait for the enemy to arrive at your coastline, you have already lost. The only defense for an island nation is aggressive, violent offense. In the spring of 1587, Drake received a commission that was vague enough to be deniable but clear enough to act upon. He was to impeach the joining together of the King of Spain's fleet. True to form, barely had the ink dried on the parchment before Drake was gone. He sailed from Plymouth with a haste that suggested he was fleeing a crime scene, and in a way he was. He knew Elizabeth's vacillating nature. Indeed, a messenger was already galloping toward the coast with a counterorder demanding he return, but Drake was already hull down on the horizon. He had missed the post. On the late afternoon of the 19th of April, Drake's squadron arrived off the Bay of Cadiz. What he saw would have made a lesser commander turn back. Cadiz was the primary staging post for the Armada. The harbor was crowded with over 60 ships, transports, supply vessels, and warships. It was protected by shore batteries and guarded by a squadron of galleys. To sail into such a harbor was considered tactical madness. Galleys, oared warships, were the masters of calm, enclosed waters. They could maneuver against the wind, swarm a sailing ship, and board it with hundreds of marines. Conventional wisdom dictated a blockade from the outside. Drake ignored conventional wisdom. He did not blockade, he charged. In a display of seamanship that bordered on arrogance, he led his 4 largest ships straight into the lion's den. As the English ships bore down, the Spanish galleys rowed out to intercept them, confident in their home field advantage. It was a clash of 2 eras, the medieval warfare of the Mediterranean versus the modern warfare of the Atlantic. The result was a slaughter. Drake's ships, race-built galleons with lower superstructures and heavy broadside guns, unleashed a withering hail of iron. The English gunners, drilling faster than any in the world, smashed the galleys before they could get close enough to grapple. The oared ships, fragile and crowded with men, were turned into splintered coffins. They retreated in disarray, leaving the harbor wide open. What followed was not a battle, but a systematic demolition. For the next 36 hours, Drake dominated the enemy harbor. He didn't just sink ships, he picked them apart. He looted the wine, the oil, and the biscuits intended for the invasion force. He burned the transports down to the waterline. The night sky over Cadiz turned an apocalyptic orange as ship after ship was consumed by fire, the flames reflecting off the water and the terrified faces of the citizens watching from the walls. But amidst the burning hulls, Drake destroyed something far more valuable than gold and far more deadly than gunpowder. He found huge stockpiles of seasoned barrel staves, hoops and planks of oak that had been drying for months, intended to make the casks for the Armada's food and water. He burned them all. It seemed like a minor detail, burning wood, but it was a stroke of strategic genius that would doom the Armada before it even sailed. Green, unseasoned wood cannot hold water, it rots and leaks. By destroying the seasoned staves, Drake ensured that when the Armada finally did sail, their water would putrefy and their food would spoil within weeks. He wasn't just fighting the ships, he was fighting the logistics of the invasion. Drake left Cadiz only when there was nothing left to burn. He had destroyed nearly 30 ships and thousands of tons of supplies. As he sailed away, he left a message of supreme contempt. He didn't run for home. He loitered off the Portuguese coast, taunting the Spanish Admiral Santa Cruz to come out and fight, capturing even more ships, including a massive Portuguese carrack, the San Felipe, laden with the wealth of the East Indies. When he finally returned to England, the invasion had been cancelled for the year. The Bank of Spain was in chaos, the plans were in ruins, and the king was humiliated. Drake quipped with a dark, satisfied humor that he had singed the King of Spain's beard. It was a flippant remark, but it masked a profound victory. He had bought England the one thing it needed most: time. The Armada would not sail in 1587, it would sail in 1588. And that single year of delay gave England the chance to prepare, a chance that would make the difference between survival and extinction. The year of reprieve is over. The delay bought by the burning of the barrel staves at Cadiz has run its course. It is now the summer of 1588, and the enterprise of England is no longer a plan on a desk in Madrid. It is a physical reality ploughing through the Atlantic swell. From the mouth of the Tagus River in Lisbon, the Invincible Armada spills out into the open ocean. To the modern mind, accustomed to steel battleships and aircraft carriers, it is difficult to grasp the sheer psychological terror this fleet inspired. It was a floating city, 130 ships, 30,000 men. It stretched for miles across the horizon, a forest of masts and crucifixes moving with a slow, terrifying inevitability. This was not merely a naval force, it was a crusade. On board were hundreds of priests and friars, carrying with them the vestments to be worn for the Mass of Thanksgiving in St. Paul's Cathedral. They carried the instruments of the Inquisition, ready to root out the heresy that had infected the northern island. Every sailor had confessed and received communion before sailing. Gambling and swearing were forbidden on pain of death. They believed, with absolute sincerity, that they were doing God's work. Leading this behemoth was the Duke of Medina Sidonia. He was a wealthy aristocrat, a loyal administrator, and a man of immense dignity. He was also, by his own admission, entirely unqualified. He suffered from crippling seasickness and had no naval experience. He had begged the king not to send him, writing, "I know by experience of the little I have been at sea that I am always seasick and always catch cold." But King Philip was not interested in aptitude. He was interested in rank and obedience. He needed a figurehead who would follow orders without question, unlike the brilliant but unpredictable genius of the late Admiral Santa Cruz. The Spanish plan was simple, logical, and deadly. The Armada was not intending to invade England by itself. Its mission was to sail up the English Channel, secure control of the narrow seas, and link up with the Duke of Parma in the Netherlands. Parma had an army of 27,000 battle-hardened veterans waiting on the coast of Flanders, the finest soldiers in Europe. The Armada would act as a bridge, ferrying this unstoppable killing machine across the water to Kent. Once Parma's army landed on English soil, the war would be effectively over. England had no standing army. Its defense relied on local militias, poorly trained farmers armed with rusty bills and bows. They would be swept aside by the Spanish tercios like wheat before a scythe. The road to London would be open. Elizabeth would be deposed, imprisoned, or executed. The stakes could not have been higher. In England, the atmosphere was one of suffocating dread. The wall of wood, the Royal Navy, was the only thing standing between the nation and slavery. But the English fleet was a chaotic mix of the Queen's royal galleons and armed merchant ships volunteered by private citizens. They gathered at Plymouth, trapped by the very wind that was bringing the enemy toward them. Then, on the 19th of July, the moment arrived. A scout ship, the Golden Hind, not Drake's original, but named in honor, raced into Plymouth Harbor with the news the Armada had been sighted off the Lizard. The reaction was immediate and visceral. The order was given to light the beacons. One by one, points of fire erupted on the hilltops along the coast, from Cornwall to Devon, across the rolling downs to the Chilterns, and finally to the heart of London. The warning spread at the speed of light. It was a binary signal of doom. To the villagers watching the flames leap into the night sky, it meant only one thing: they are here. Church bells rang in reverse, the clash of invasion. Men said goodbye to their families and grabbed their weapons to muster at the coast, knowing it was a futile gesture if the ships failed. The Queen moved to Tilbury to address her troops, preparing to die with her people. In Plymouth, the English commanders faced a tactical nightmare. The wind was blowing from the southwest, perfect for the Spanish, disastrous for the English. They were bottled up in the harbor. If the Spanish Armada arrived while the English were still anchored, they could send in fireships or simply blockade them and land the army at their leisure. Francis Drake, now Vice Admiral of the fleet, stood on the Hoe at Plymouth. The legend says he was playing bowls, a display of supreme nonchalance designed to calm the panic of his men. But beneath the swagger, his mind must have been racing. He knew the numbers. He knew the Spanish ships were floating fortresses, their decks crowded with musketeers, designed to grapple and board. He knew the English ships were smaller, lower, and carried fewer men. The contest that was about to unfold was not just England versus Spain. It was a clash of philosophies. The Spanish wanted a land battle at sea, close quarters, grappling hooks, cold steel. The English, led by the innovations of Hawkins and Drake, were betting everything on a new way of fighting, standoff gunnery. They had to keep the monster at arm's length. They had to dance around the giant and bleed him to death without ever getting within reach of his grip. As the sun rose on the 20th of July, the English fleet struggled to warp out of the harbor against the wind. And there on the horizon they saw it, the Armada. It was sailing in a crescent formation, 7 miles wide from tip to tip. It was a defensive masterstroke, a formation so tight and disciplined that it looked impenetrable, a wall of wood and iron moving inexorably toward the heart of England. The waiting was over. The guns were run out. The fate of the Western world now hung on the shift of the wind and the aim of a cannon. The story of Francis Drake playing bowls on Plymouth Hoe is perhaps the most enduring myth in British naval history. It is the defining image of the Elizabethan spirit, nonchalant, unflappable, and defiantly cool in the face of annihilation. The legend goes that on the afternoon of July 19, 1588, the Scottish captain Thomas Fleming rushed onto the green where the English commanders were relaxing. Breathless, he delivered the news that the Spanish Armada had been sighted off the Lizard, the rocky tip of Cornwall. Panic should have ensued. The invasion force was hours away. The English fleet was trapped in the harbor by the incoming tide and an adverse wind. Yet, according to the story, Drake simply bent down, polished his wood, and remarked, "We have time enough to finish the game and beat the Spaniards too." Historians have argued for centuries over whether these words were ever actually spoken. But in a sense, the factual accuracy is irrelevant. The story survived because it captures the essence of the psychological warfare Drake was waging, not just against the Spanish, but against his own fear. We must remember who was standing on that green. It was not just Drake. It was the entire high command of the English fleet. There was Lord Howard of Effingham, the Lord High Admiral, a cousin of the Queen, a man of immense aristocratic standing but limited naval experience. There was John Hawkins, the architect of the new navy, looking old and grim. And there was Martin Frobisher, a rough, violent man who despised Drake and considered him an upstart pirate. The tension between these men was palpable. They were waiting for the end of the world. If they lost the coming battle, they would be executed as traitors and heretics. The Queen would fall. England would burn. In that atmosphere of suffocating dread, panic was the real enemy. If the sailors saw their commanders running for the boats, screaming orders in a frenzy, morale would have collapsed before a single shot was fired. Drake's refusal to panic was a calculated performance. It was a signal to the thousands of terrified men watching from the ships and the shore, "I am not afraid, so you should not be either." It was an act of supreme arrogance, yes, but it was also an act of leadership. He reduced the Invincible Armada to a nuisance, something that could wait until he had finished his game. However, there was a pragmatic truth hiding behind the bravado. Drake didn't finish his game because he was arrogant. He finished it because he had no choice. The English fleet was tide-locked. The wind was blowing from the southwest, pushing directly into Plymouth Sound. The tide was flooding in. To try and sail out against both wind and tide would have been impossible. The ships would have been driven onto the rocks or left drifting helplessly in the channel, sitting ducks for the Spanish vanguard. Drake knew they had to wait for the tide to turn. He knew they had to wait for dusk. The game of bowls was simply a way to kill the agonizing hours until the physics of the ocean allowed them to move. But when night fell, the game ended, and the real work began. What happened next was a feat of seamanship that far outshines the legend of the bowls. In the pitch black of the moonless night, the English fleet performed a miracle. They lowered their longboats and used sheer muscle power to tow the massive galleons out of the harbor, warping them against the wind, inch by agonizing inch. It was a desperate, silent struggle. Thousands of men straining at the oars, sweating in the darkness, trying to sneak an entire navy past the enemy. Their goal was to get behind the armada. In the age of sail, the wind was everything. If you were upwind of your enemy, if you held the weather gauge, you controlled the battle. You could choose when to attack and when to retreat. If you were downwind, you were helpless. The Spanish, confident in their crescent formation, sailed past Plymouth, assuming the English were still trapped inside. They dropped anchor, expecting to bottle the English up the next morning. But when the sun rose on the 20th of July, the Spanish commanders looked back and were horrified. The sea in front of them was empty. They turned around to look behind them, and there, backlit by the rising sun, was the English fleet. Drake and Howard had done the impossible. They had stolen the wind. They had sailed around the flank of the Armada in the dark and were now poised to strike from the rear. The game of bowls was over. The psychological victory had been won on the green at Plymouth, but the tactical victory had been won in the sweating darkness of the Channel. Drake had positioned the English fleet exactly where he wanted it, snapping at the heels of the Spanish giant, ready to chase it all the way to hell. Sunday morning, the 21st of July, dawned with a spectacle that the English Channel had never seen before and would never see again. On one side, the Spanish Armada, a floating city of castles, moving with a terrifying, slow solemnity. On the other, the English fleet, a swarm of wasps, darting in and out of the mist. The Battle of the Channel had begun, but it was not the battle anyone had expected. The English commanders, Lord Howard and Drake, had placed their faith in a revolutionary idea, that they could destroy the enemy from a distance. They believed their heavy guns, the culverins and demi-cannon, would smash the Spanish hulls long before the enemy could get close enough to use their terrifying infantry. But as the first broadsides thundered across the water, a cold realization washed over the English flagship. It wasn't working. The Spanish formation was a masterpiece of defensive warfare. They sailed in a tight, disciplined crescent, a half-moon of oak and iron. The strongest galleons, the 12 Apostles, held the wings, while the vulnerable transport ships were protected in the soft center. It was like a porcupine. However the English attacked, they were met with a wall of prickly defenses. The English ships would race in, unleash a volley of cannon fire, and then tack away desperately before the Spanish grappling hooks could snag them. For the English sailors, it was an agonizing exercise in frustration. They saw their cannonballs, fired from too great a distance, simply bouncing off the 4-foot-thick hulls of the Spanish flagships. They were making a lot of noise, creating a lot of smoke, but they were not stopping the monster. The Armada simply kept moving, inexorably, like a landslide in slow motion, heading for the Isle of Wight. But the greatest threat to the English fleet that first night came not from the Spanish, but from their own vice-admiral. As dusk fell on Sunday night, Francis Drake was given the most critical job in the fleet. He was to lead the English line. His ship, the Revenge, carried the stern lantern, a massive light that acted as the beacon for the rest of the Navy to follow in the pitch blackness. Every captain in the English fleet was watching that light. It was their only reference point in the treacherous, dark waters. And then, without warning, the light went out. Drake had extinguished his lantern. For the rest of the fleet, it was a moment of sheer panic. Lord Howard, in the Ark Royal, blindly followed what he thought was Drake's light, only to find himself at dawn almost surrounded by the enemy fleet. The English line was scattered, confused, and dangerously exposed. Where was Drake? He had spotted a shadow in the darkness. The Spanish galleon Nuestra Señora del Rosario, a massive 46-gun warship commanded by Don Pedro de Valdez, had collided with another Spanish ship and lost its bowsprit. It was crippled, drifting behind the safety of the Crescent Formation. Drake saw the straggler, and in that moment the admiral vanished and the pirate returned. He forgot his orders. He forgot the safety of the fleet. He forgot the Queen. He saw a wounded bird laden with gold, and the temptation was too great. He doused his lantern so no one else would see the prize, and he slipped away into the dark to hunt. When dawn broke, Drake was found alongside the Rosario. He didn't even have to fire a shot. He simply sent a boat over and announced that Francis Drake was waiting. The terror of his name was so great that Don Pedro de Valdez, a proud knight of Santiago, surrendered immediately. He bowed to the legend, not the ship. Drake spent the day securing his prize. The Rosario was carrying 50,000 gold ducats, the payroll for the Spanish army. Drake filled his pockets, charmed his noble prisoner, and sent the captured ship back to Torbay. He had struck a blow against Spain, certainly. He had captured a flagship and a fortune, but the cost was trust. When he rejoined the fleet, the reception was frosty. Martin Frobisher, a man who hated Drake at the best of times, was incandescent with rage. He openly accused Drake of cowardice and greed, shouting that Drake had risked the kingdom to fill his own purse. "He thinks to cozen us of our shares of 15,000 ducats, Frobisher raged, "but we will have our share, or I will make him spend the best blood in his belly." The unity of the English command was fracturing just when it was needed most. For the next week, the running battle continued up the Channel. Portland Bill, the Isle of Wight, the Oas, each headland saw a desperate skirmish. The English fought bravely. They fired over 100,000 rounds of ammunition. They worked their crews to the point of collapse, but they could not break the Crescent. They could not stop the Armada. By Saturday, the 27th of July, the reality of the situation was terrifying. The Armada had survived the gauntlet. They dropped anchor off Calais, France. They were battered, yes, but they were intact, and they were now just 30 miles from the Duke of Parma's army. The English fleet anchored just a cannon shot away, bobbing in the swell. The mood on the English ships was grim. They had fired almost every shot they had. They were exhausted, and looking across the water at the forest of Spanish masts, they knew they had failed. The enemy had reached their destination. If the Spanish could coordinate with Parma, the invasion barges would cross the Channel within days. The long-range gunnery had failed. The scientific war was over. The English commanders realized that if they were to save their country, they would have to do something desperate. They would have to get close. They would have to break the rules of civilized warfare. As the sun set over Calais, casting long shadows over the two great fleets, Francis Drake looked at the tight, impenetrable formation of the Spanish ships and realized that the only way to break them was to burn them. The sun set on Sunday, the 7th of August, 1588, leaving the English Channel bathed in a bruised purple twilight. Off the coast of Calais, the sea was a forest of masts. The Spanish Armada lay at anchor, a brooding wooden city rocking gently on the swell. To the English commanders watching from a mile away, the sight was terrifyingly impressive. The Spanish discipline held firm. Their crescent formation, the iron wall that had deflected every English attack for a week, was still intact. They were battered, they were tired, but they were unbroken, and they were now within touching distance of the Duke of Parma's army. Inside the great cabin of the Ark Royal, the mood was desperate. Lord Howard, Francis Drake, John Hawkins, and Martin Frobisher sat around a table strewn with charts. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool and candle wax. They knew the mathematics of the situation better than anyone. They had fired over 100,000 rounds of ammunition. They had exhausted their crews. They had chased the Spanish for 7 days and 300 miles, and yet they had not sunk a single major enemy warship. If the sun rose tomorrow, with the Spanish fleet still in formation, the invasion barges would begin to cross. The time for gentlemanly gunnery was over. The time for tactics was gone. They needed chaos. Drake, the man who had made his name by breaking the rules, looked at the tide charts. The current was flooding towards the French coast, directly towards the anchored Spanish fleet. The wind was blowing from the south-southwest, a perfect, deadly alignment. The decision was made in seconds. They would not wait for fireships to be sent from Dover. They would burn their own. It was a sacrifice that went against every instinct of a sailor. Ships were precious, expensive living things. To murder a ship was a sin, but the order went out. 8 vessels were selected from the fleet, merchantmen, supply ships, the Thomas of Plymouth. They were not old hulks. They were fully rigged, seaworthy vessels. That night, under the frantic supervision of the boatswains, they were transformed into floating bombs. The crews worked in a frenzy of silence. They stripped the ships of anything valuable, then loaded them with the ingredients of hell. Barrels of pitch, resin, and brimstone were smashed open and poured over the decks. Faggots of dry wood were stacked in the rigging. The guns were double-shotted, not to fire at the enemy, but to cook off in the heat, exploding randomly to terrify anyone who tried to approach. Tar was daubed on the sails. The very air around the English fleet began to smell of sulphur. Midnight struck, the tide turned. On the decks of the Spanish flagships, the sentries were peering into the gloom. The water was black, the sky moonless. The silence was heavy, broken only by the creaking of timbers and the slap of water against the hulls. Then, a spark. 2 miles away, a single point of light appeared, then another, then another. 8 glowing eyes opened in the darkness. For a few moments, there was confusion. Fireships were a known tactic in naval warfare, annoying, certainly, but usually manageable. You sent out small boats with grappling hooks to tow them away, but as the 8 ships caught the wind and the tide, they did not just burn, they erupted. The pitch and resin took hold with a ferocity that turned the night into day. Great tongues of flame leaped up the masts, consuming the canvas sails in seconds, creating towering pyramids of fire that roared like furnaces. But it was not the fire that caused the panic, it was the memory. 3 years earlier, at the Siege of Antwerp, an Italian engineer named Federico Gimbelli had unleashed Hellburners against the Spanish besiegers. These were not normal fireships. They were floating mines, packed with thousands of pounds of gunpowder and brickwork, which exploded with the force of a small nuclear weapon, vaporizing 1,000 men in a blink. As the 8 blazing ships bore down on the Armada, carried swiftly by the tide, a scream of terror went up from the Spanish decks. La Maquinas de Minas, the fire machines. The Spanish believed that Drake, the sorcerer, the dragon, had enlisted Gimbelli. They believed these ships were about to detonate and obliterate the entire fleet. Panic, cold and absolute, swept through the Invincible Armada. The Duke of Medina Sidonia, usually so calm, tried to maintain order. He fired a signal gun, ordering the fleet to weigh anchor, to winch them up properly so they could maneuver and return. But it was too late. The terror of the Hellburners had seized the captains. They looked at the approaching walls of fire, spitting cannonballs as the heat set off their guns, and they lost their nerve. They did not weigh anchor, they cut the cables. The sound must have been like whip cracks echoing across the water. One by one, the great galleons severed their connection to the seabed. The heavy hemp ropes were hacked through with axes. The anchors, their only safety in the treacherous currents of the channel, were abandoned in the mud. What followed was catastrophe. The Armada ceased to be a fleet and became a mob. Drifting helplessly in the dark, pushed by the strong tide and the rising wind, the massive ships began to collide. The discipline that had held them together for weeks evaporated in seconds. The flagship of the galleasses, the San Lorenzo, crashed into the San Juan de Sicilia, tearing off her rudder. Shouts of men, the grinding of oak on oak, and the roar of the approaching fireships filled the air. Ironically, not a single Spanish ship was actually set on fire by Drake's vessels. The fireships drifted harmlessly through the scattering fleet and burned themselves out on the French beaches, but they had done their work. They had achieved what all the guns of the English Navy could not. They had broken the formation. As the sun rose on the morning of the 8th of August, the sea-off Gravellines presented a scene of utter disarray. The Invincible Crescent was gone. The Spanish ships were scattered over miles of open water, rudderless, anchorless, and terrified. They were no longer a mutual defense system. They were a collection of isolated targets. Francis Drake, watching from the deck of the Revenge, must have smiled the grim smile of a predator who sees the herd scatter. The wall was breached, the shield was down, the Spanish were vulnerable, and the wind was blowing them towards the treacherous sandbanks of Flanders. He did not wait for orders from Lord Howard. He did not call a council of war. He signalled his squadron to attack. The hunt was on. The night of fire was over. The day of slaughter was about to begin. The dawn of August the 8th, 1588, broke over a scene of grey desolation and impending slaughter. The English Channel, usually a highway of commerce, had been transformed into a killing field. The mighty crescent formation of the Armada, which had served as an impenetrable shield for a week, was gone. In its place was a chaotic scatter of isolated ships, rolling heavily in the swell, drifting dangerously close to the treacherous sandbanks of the Flemish coast. Francis Drake, standing on the quarterdeck of the Revenge, looked out at the disarray and knew that the moment he had spent his entire life waiting for had finally arrived. The Spanish were no longer a fleet, they were a mob. They had cut their anchors in the terror of the night. They were tired, demoralized, and crucially, they were separated. Drake did not wait for Lord Howard to hoist the signal. He did not wait for a council of war. With the instinct of a wolf spotting a limping stag, he ordered the Revenge to pile on sail. He steered his ship not away from the Spanish giants, but directly at them. But this time, the rules of engagement had changed. For a week, the English had fought a cautious, long-range duel, firing from a safe distance to avoid the deadly grappling hooks of the Spanish infantry. It had been safe, but it had been ineffective. The thick oak hulls of the Spanish galleons had shrugged off the English cannonballs like hail off a tin roof. Drake knew that to kill the beast, he had to get inside its guard. He had to get close, terrifyingly close. The Revenge surged forward, leading the English squadron towards the Spanish flagship, the San Martin. The distance closed rapidly, 500 yards, 300 yards. The Spanish gunners, seeing the English ship rushing towards them, prepared to fire, expecting the English to turn away at the last moment, as they always did. But Drake didn't turn. He held his course until he was within 100 yards, hailing distance. He was so close he could see the faces of the Spanish officers on the poop deck. He was so close that a musket ball could span the gap. Only then, when the hull of the San Martin loomed like a cliff face above him, did he give the order. The broadside of the Revenge erupted. At this range, the physics of naval warfare changed instantly. The English culverins and demi-cannon were no longer knocking on the door, they were kicking it down. The iron shot didn't bounce. It smashed through the seasoned oak, tearing massive, jagged holes in the Spanish hull. But the true horror was not the water rushing in, it was the wood flying out. When a cannonball strikes a wooden ship at point-blank range, the oak planks do not just break, they explode. They shatter into a cloud of razor-sharp splinters, some as small as needles, others as large as spears. These splinters became shrapnel, tearing through the crowded decks of the Spanish ships, where hundreds of soldiers were packed tight, waiting to board. The result was an abattoir. The San Martin shuddered under the impact. Within minutes, her decks were slippery with blood. The English ships following Drake, the Triumph, the Victory, the Mary Rose, mimicked his tactic. They swooped in, delivered a devastating point-blank broadside, and then used their superior speed to veer away before the Spanish could throw their grappling hooks. It was a tactical revolution. The Spanish were fighting a medieval battle, trying to turn the sea into a land war where they could use their swords and pikes. The English were fighting the first modern naval battle, using the ship itself as a weapon platform, a mobile battery of destruction. The Spanish captains, brave men like Don Alonso de Leyva, screamed at their crews to grapple, to board, to close with the enemy. But the English ships were like ghosts. They were too fast, too nimble. They danced around the lumbering galleons, stinging them to death. The battle raged for 9 hours. It was a chaotic, swirling melee of smoke and noise. The roar of the guns was so continuous that men on the English coast, miles away, said the ground trembled. But in the Channel, the sound was deafening. It was a cacophony of thunder, the cracking of timber, the screaming of wounded men, and the eerie, whistling sound of the wind through the rigging. The plight of the Spanish was horrific. Their guns, often mounted on clumsy carriages that were hard to reload, fell silent. After the first volley, many Spanish ships could not drag their heavy cannons back inboard to reload them in the chaos of the heaving decks. They were reduced to floating targets. The English, with their truck-mounted guns and drilled crews, were firing 3 or 4 shots for every one of the Spanish. The galleon San Mateo became a focal point of the tragedy. Isolated and surrounded by English ships, she was pounded until she was little more than a floating wreck. Her rigging was shot away, her masts were tottering, and her hull was riddled like a sieve. The English captains, seeing the slaughter, hailed her, offering quarter, a chance to surrender and live. But the Spanish captain, Don Diego de Pimentel, standing amidst the carnage of his crew, climbed onto the high poop deck. He looked at the English ships circling him and shouted back a refusal. He would sink before he struck his colors. It was a display of suicidal bravery that earned the grudging respect of the English, but bravery could not stop a 20-pound iron ball. The slaughter continued. The scuppers, the small drainage holes along the sides of the decks designed to let seawater wash away, began to run red. Witnesses described a literal river of blood pouring from the sides of the Spanish ships, staining the grey waters of the North Sea. By the early afternoon, the Invincible Armada was on the brink of annihilation. 3 great ships had been sunk or captured. The Maria Juan was visibly sinking, her crew crying out to God as the water rose. The rest of the fleet was battered, leaking, and crowded with dying men. But the greatest danger was not the English guns, it was the geography. The wind, the Protestant wind, was blowing hard from the northwest. It was pushing the crippled Spanish ships inexorably towards the banks of Zealand, miles of treacherous, shifting sandbars where the water was only a few feet deep. The English knew what was happening. They stopped firing. They didn't need to waste any more powder. They simply shadowed the Spanish, herding them like sheep towards the cliff edge. Medina Sidonia, on the deck of the shattered San Martin, looked at the sounding lead. 7 fathoms, 6 fathoms, 5. They were minutes away from running aground. If they hit the banks, the ships would break their backs, and thousands of men would drown or be massacred by the Dutch rebels waiting on the shore. The entire enterprise, the years of planning, the wealth of the Indies, it was all about to end in a sandy graveyard. Drake watched from the Revenge. He had shattered the myth of Spanish invincibility. He had taken the greatest empire the world had ever known and reduced it to a drifting, bleeding wreck. He had proven that a small island with fast ships and big guns could defy the masters of the world. But just as the catastrophe seemed absolute, the weather played its final trick. The wind suddenly shifted. It veered to the southwest. It was a miraculous reprieve for the Spanish. It allowed them to claw their way off the sandbanks back into the deep water of the North Sea. But they were not saved. They were merely granted a different kind of death. The way back to the Channel was blocked by the English fleet. The way east was blocked by the Dutch. There was only one way to go, north, into the cold, unknown waters around Scotland and Ireland. The Battle of Gravelines was over. The English had not sunk the entire fleet, but they had done something far more important. They had broken its spirit. They had shattered the formation. The invasion was cancelled. The Duke of Parma would never step foot in England. As the smoke cleared and the English sailors collapsed from exhaustion, their faces blackened with powder, they watched the Invincible Armada turn its tail and flee into the grey mists of the North Sea. The dragon had won. But the sea was not finished with the Spanish yet. The battle was over, but the dying had only just begun. For 2 days, Francis Drake and the English fleet shadowed the retreating Armada, following them north into the grey, freezing expanse of the North Sea. It was a pursuit born of bluff and bravado. The English ships were empty. Their powder rooms were swept clean. They didn't have enough shot left to fight a skirmish, let alone a battle. Drake was, in his own words, putting on a brag, escorting the enemy off the premises with an empty gun pointed at their heads. At the Firth of Forth, the English turned back. They were starving, their water was putrid, and typhus was beginning to ravage their crews. They left the Spanish to the mercy of the elements, and the elements were far crueler than any English cannon. The Spanish Armada was now a ghost fleet. They had no chance for these waters. Their anchors were gone, left in the mud off Calais. Their hulls were shattered, wrapped in cables to keep them from falling apart. And crucially, they were thirsty. The casks of water, the ones whose staves Drake had burned at Cadiz, had rotted. The water was green slime. To save what little they had, Medina Sidonia gave the order to throw the cavalry horses overboard. Hundreds of magnificent Andalusian stallions were pushed into the freezing waves. It is said that for days afterwards, the German sailors crossing the North Sea saw the heads of swimming horses bobbing in the mist, a surreal and horrific testament to the defeat. As they rounded the tip of Scotland, the weather turned. This was not a normal summer storm. It was a meteorological anomaly, a series of Atlantic depressions of hurricane force that slammed into the fleet with the violence of a hammer. The Spanish sailors, men of the Mediterranean accustomed to the warm sun and gentle swells, were plunged into a freezing hell. They were wearing summer tunics. They froze to death at the helm. Then came the navigation error that sealed their doom. The Spanish navigators calculated their position by dead reckoning. They believed they were far out into the Atlantic, safe to turn south for Spain. They did not know about the Gulf Stream, the powerful current that pushes north. It had slowed their progress. They weren't out in the open ocean. They were dangerously close to the jagged, unforgiving coast of Ireland. When they turned south, they didn't sail for home. They sailed directly onto the rocks. The destruction was biblical. From Donegal to Kerry, the pride of Spain was smashed to pieces against the cliffs. The Gianna, carrying the survivors of 2 other wrecks, was torn apart at the Giant's Causeway. Of the 1,300 men on board, only 9 survived. In Sligo, an eyewitness walked along the beach and counted 1,100 bodies in a single morning, as great as sea rocks, bloated and battered by the surf. Those who made it to shore found no sanctuary. The English authorities in Ireland, terrified of a Spanish invasion, had issued a simple order: take no prisoners. The survivors, half drowned and starving, were hunted down by English soldiers and local lords. They were clubbed to death on the sand, stripped of their clothes, and left for the wolves. The Invincible Armada ended not in glory, but in a muddy, bloody massacre on the beaches of the west of Ireland. Of the 130 ships that sailed, a third were lost. 20,000 men never saw Spain again. Back in England, the victory was celebrated with bonfires and bells. A commemorative medal was struck with the Latin inscription, Flavit Jehovah et dissipati sunt, God blew, and they were scattered. It was the ultimate propaganda victory. God was Protestant. He had sent the wind to save his queen. But for the ordinary sailors who had saved England, there was no glory. There was only betrayal. The English fleet returned to port not to a hero's welcome, but to a plague. Typhus, the jail fever, swept through the ships. And the Queen, Elizabeth I, with the treasury empty and her parsimony legendary, refused to pay them off. She argued that if she discharged them, she would have to pay their wages, but if they died, she owed them nothing. It is one of the darkest stains on the Elizabethan Golden Age. Men who had fought off the greatest empire on earth were left to rot in the gutters of Margate and Plymouth, dying of starvation and disease in the very country they had saved. Lord Howard, a man of immense nobility, was reduced to using his own personal money to buy wine and blankets for his dying crew, writing in despair to the Queen, "It is a most pitiful sight to see, here at Margate, how the men, having no place to receive them into, die in the streets." Francis Drake survived the sickness, but the bitterness of the aftermath lingered. The Protestant wind had saved the nation, but it blew cold comfort for the men who had harnessed it. The storm had washed away the threat of invasion, but it had also washed away the illusion of glory. War, Drake had learned once again, was not a romance. It was a tragedy in 3 acts: violence, misery, and ingratitude. History is cruel to its heroes. It rarely allows them to walk away while the applause is still ringing. For Francis Drake, the tragedy was that he lived too long. The man who had saved England in 1588 did not retire into a glorious sunset. Instead, he spent his final years chasing a ghost, trying to recapture a magic that had vanished with his youth. In 1589, just a year after the Armada, Drake was given command of the Counter Armada. It was a massive, ambitious project intended to crush the surviving Spanish navy in port and place a pretender on the throne of Portugal. It was also a catastrophe. Drake, blinded by his own legend, hesitated at Lisbon. He refused to sail up the Tagus River to support the army, mirroring the caution of the Spanish commanders he had once mocked. The expedition dissolved in a mess of disease, drunkenness, and tactical paralysis. Thousands of English sailors died, not from enemy fire, but from fever and bad leadership. Drake returned to England in disgrace. The queen, whose money he had squandered, refused to see him. The dragon was grounded. For 6 long years, the greatest admiral in the world was reduced to the role of a municipal administrator. He became the mayor of Plymouth. He built a leat to bring fresh water to the town, a noble task, certainly, but a humiliating domesticity for a man who had circumnavigated the globe. He sat in Parliament, he managed his estates, and he watched from the shore as the war with Spain dragged on without him. But the sea called him back. In 1595, with the war stalemated and the Queen desperate for money, she unleashed her old dogs one last time. Drake was reunited with his cousin and mentor, John Hawkins. They were given a fleet and a simple order: go to the Caribbean, burn Panama, and steal the King of Spain's gold. It was a voyage of the damned from the start. Drake and Hawkins, once a terrifying duo, were now 2 old men arguing over tactics. Hawkins was cautious, Drake was reckless, and neither was the man he used to be. And crucially, the world had changed. The Spanish had learned. They had fortified their ports. They had built a warning system. The element of surprise, Drake's greatest weapon, was gone. The raid was a series of failures. They were repulsed at San Juan. Hawkins, heartbroken and sick, died off the coast of Puerto Rico. Drake was alone again, but he pressed on, driven by a desperate, delusional need for one last victory. He attacked Panama, the scene of his greatest triumph 20 years earlier, but his men were hacked to pieces in the jungle. The Spanish were waiting for him. On the morning of the 28th of January, 1596, off the coast of Portobello, the end came. It was not a cannonball that killed Sir Francis Drake. It was a microbe. He had contracted dysentery, the bloody flux. The man who had defied empires, survived storms, and outwitted death a dozen times was dissolving from the inside out in a sweltering, fever-ridden cabin. In his final hours, delirious and in pain, he rose from his bed. He asked his servant to help him put on his armor. He would not die in his nightshirt like a sick old man. He would die as a knight of the realm. He gripped his sword, mumbled incoherently about the Spanish gold he would never reach, and then the dragon slept. His funeral was the most solemn ever seen in those waters. They placed his body in a lead coffin, heavy, sealed, and permanent. Amidst the thunder of a final cannon salute, they slid him into the sea. He plummeted into the dark water of the Caribbean, the very graveyard he had filled with his enemies. He lies there still, somewhere beneath the waves of Portobello, a warrior buried in his armor, forever guarding the Spanish lake that he, and he alone, had dared to claim. How do we weigh the soul of a man like Sir Francis Drake? As the water settles over his lead coffin in the Caribbean, and the smoke of the Elizabethan age clears, we are left with a figure who defies simple categorization. To the Spanish, he was El Drac, the dragon, a heretic and a terrorist who violated the sanctity of their empire. To the Victorians, he was a marble saint, the chivalrous embodiment of English pluck and daring. But the truth, as we have seen, is far more jagged. Drake was not a one-dimensional hero. He was a man of profound, often terrifying contradictions. He was a deeply religious man who read psalms to his crew, yet he built his fortune on the kidnapping and selling of human beings. We cannot tell the story of his glory without acknowledging the story of his shame. The gold that paved the way for the Royal Navy was, in part, blood money earned in the pestilential holds of slaving ships off the coast of Africa. To ignore this is to sanitize history, to turn a complex human being into a comfortable myth. Yet it is undeniable that without Francis Drake, the history of the world would look very different. He was the architect of a naval revolution. Before Drake, sea battles were land battles fought on water, static, clumsy affairs of grappling hooks and floating castles. Drake changed the geometry of war. He taught the English Navy that speed was armor, that the wind was a weapon, and that a ship was not just a transport for soldiers, but a mobile battery of destruction. The tactics he employed at the Battle of Gravelines, the standoff gunnery, the aggressive use of weather, the refusal to play by the enemy's rules, became the DNA of the Royal Navy. The line from Drake runs directly to Nelson at Trafalgar. He proved that an island nation, no matter how small, could project power to the ends of the earth. He broke the psychological shackles of the Spanish Empire. Before the Golden Hind, the Pacific was a Spanish lake, and Philip II was a god. Drake proved that the god could bleed. He showed that the world was not the property of Rome or Madrid. In doing so, he inadvertently laid the first stone of the British Empire, opening the sea lanes that English merchant ships would dominate for the next 3 centuries. But perhaps his most enduring legacy is not tactical, but spiritual. He gave England a myth to live by. The image of the lone sailor standing on the quarterdeck, facing impossible odds with a smirk and a game of bowls, became a part of the national psyche. It is a dangerous myth, one that often glorifies recklessness, but it is also a potent one. It is the belief that with enough audacity, skill, and perhaps a little bit of piracy, the little island can stand against the giants. In Buckland Abbey, his home in Devon, there sits a drum. Legend says it accompanied him on his voyages around the world. On his deathbed, he is said to have whispered a final promise. "Take my drum to England, hang it by the shore, strike it when your powder's running low. If the Dons sight Devon, I'll quit the port, o' heaven, and drum them up the channel as we drummed them long ago." It is a ghost story, of course, but in the darkest days of British history, when Napoleon looked across the channel, or when the Luftwaffe darkened the skies in 1940, people swore they could hear a low, rhythmic beating coming from the coast of Devon. Francis Drake, the pirate, the slaver, the savior, may be sleeping in the Caribbean slime, but his spirit still patrols the grey waters of the Channel, the eternal, complicated guardian of the wooden wall.